The wagon stopped at the edge of Marcus Garrett's land on August 3rd, 1886. Caleb Morrison climbed down with nothing but the clothes he wore and the shame his stepmother had pinned to his chest like a badge. Judge Marcus Garrett sat behind a desk that wasn't a bench in a room that wasn't a courtroom, dispensing justice that wasn't justice at all. The Medora Stockmen's Association Hall smelled of tobacco and leather and the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice. Caleb Morrison, the old man said, adjusting spectacles that caught the afternoon light streaming through dusty windows. You stand accused of horse theft, specifically the theft of one thoroughbred stallion valued at $200 property of my son Thomas Garrett. Caleb stood with his hands cuffed behind his back 20 feet from his father, who sat in the gallery like a ghost. Samuel Morrison's face was the color of old parchment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls, beyond the town, beyond the reach of his own cowardice. How do you plead not guilty? Caleb's voice didn't shake. That surprised him. I didn't steal anything. Your son planted that horse in our barn. Everyone in this room knows it. Marcus Garrett's expression didn't change. Men with that much power didn't need expressions. They had gavels. The evidence says otherwise. Pete Rollins stepped forward. A ranch hand Caleb had seen exactly twice in his life walked to the front of the room. Pete was 40, weathered, with the kind of face that had learned young how to lie convincingly. State what you saw. Saw Morrison leading Wolf's stallion into his daddy's barn 2 nights past. Around midnight. I was riding fence lines, saw the whole thing clear as day. At midnight, Caleb said. You saw clear as day at midnight. Moonlight, Pete said without hesitation. Full moon, bright enough to read by. The moon had been a sliver. Caleb had checked the almanac his mother left him, the one with her handwriting in the margins, notes about heat and cold, and the way air behaved when you trapped it. He'd checked because he couldn't sleep because he was 18 and angry and stupid enough to think the world operated on truth instead of power. Second witness, Jack Sullivan. The trapper stood a man who smelled of beaver pelts and rot-gut whiskey even from across the room. Another man on Garrett's payroll, another pair of eyes that had seen exactly what they were paid to see. Found the saddle, Jack said. Morrison's workshop, hidden under a tarp. Garrett brand clear as Sunday. That saddle had appeared in the workshop the same night the horse appeared in the barn. Caleb's father had woken him at dawn, face white, hands shaking. Son, there's a horse in our barn that ain't ours. And in the workshop under a tarp, Caleb had never seen before a saddle with the Garrett brand burned into leather that still smelled of fresh oil. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Marcus Garrett already had the gavel raised. My father needs that land, Caleb said. The 20 acres along the Little Missouri. You need water for your cattle. You needed us gone. So your son put a horse in our barn and a saddle in our shop, and now you get to take everything we have because I'll hang and my father will go bankrupt paying your bank. The room went quiet, not the quiet of shock, the quiet of men watching a boy realize how the world actually worked. That's a serious accusation, Marcus said. It's the truth. Truth is what a court decides. And this court finds you guilty of horse theft. Sentenced to be carried out at dawn, August 5th. Hanging. May God have mercy on your soul. The gavel came down like a gunshot. Caleb didn't remember being dragged to the holding cell behind the sheriff's office. Didn't remember the deputy, a man named Miller who drank too much and smelled like he bathed too little, locking the iron door. He remembered his father's face in the gallery, not crying, not protesting, just sitting there with his hands folded like he was in church, waiting for a sermon to end. The cell was 8 feet by 6 feet with a cot that smelled of men who died in it and a window with bars too close together for even a child to slip through. The sun set. The town went quiet. Caleb sat on that cot and thought about his mother. Catherine Morrison had died when Caleb was 10. Fever. The kind that took women in the territories when doctors were 2 days right away, and 2 days was 2 days too long. She'd been a blacksmith's daughter back in Pennsylvania, had understood iron and heat the way some people understood scripture. The notebook she'd left him was filled with drawings, forged designs, root cellars, systems for trapping heat, for moving air, and for making the impossible the merely difficult. Heat doesn't care about walls, she'd written in the margins of a sketch showing a double-walled root cellar. Heat cares about movement. Stop the air from moving, and you stop the heat from leaving. Still air is the best insulation nature ever made. Caleb had read that notebook so many times the pages were soft as cloth. He'd read it when his father remarried. Read it when the new wife brought 3 children who looked at Caleb like he was furniture to be moved. Read it when Samuel Morrison stopped being a blacksmith and started being a man who jumped when his wife spoke. Now he read it in a cell that smelled like death under lamplight, that made the shadows dance like nooses. Footsteps at midnight, a key in the lock that opened so quietly Caleb almost didn't hear it. His father stood in the doorway outlined by moonlight, looking older than his 48 years. "There's a horse tied behind the jail," Samuel whispered. "Ashes. She's old, but she'll get you past the railroad if you ride west into the Badlands. Pa, if I run, everyone will say I'm guilty." "If you stay, you're dead." Samuel's voice cracked. "Guilty or innocent doesn't matter to a corpse." He pressed something into Caleb's hand. Coins. Caleb counted by touch. 45 cents. Everything his father had in his pockets. And something else. The notebook. His mother's notebook. "She was smarter than both of us," Samuel said. "Always was. These drawings, the heat transfer designs for the forge. She understood things I never could." "Why didn't you fight for me?" The question came out smaller than Caleb intended, like a child asking why the world was cruel. "Because I'm a coward." Samuel's eyes were wet, but no tears fell. "And you deserve better than what I gave you. Better than what I am. They'll come after me. They will. Wolf Garrett doesn't like loose ends. But if you make it to Montana territory, if you get far enough, maybe you'll have a chance. I didn't steal that horse." "I know." Samuel reached through the bars, touched Caleb's shoulder once. "I know, son. I'm sorry I couldn't say it where it mattered." Then he was gone, footsteps fading into darkness, leaving Caleb alone with 45 cents a notebook and a choice between a noose at dawn or the wilderness at midnight. The deputy was snoring when Caleb slipped past him. Samuel had loosened the window bars days ago, working at night while the town slept using tools from the blacksmith shop he no longer owned. The bars came free with barely a sound. Caleb squeezed through dropped 8 feet to hard-packed earth and ran. The horse was where his father said she'd be. Soon, 20 years old if she was a day gray as her name, with eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing good. Caleb had learned to ride on this horse, had learned most things that mattered on this horse. He swung into the saddle, turned her west, and rode into darkness. The Badlands opened before him like the earth's broken jaw. Buttes rose against the star-filled sky castles of eroded stone that held shadows dense as tar. The Little Missouri River cut through the landscape, a ribbon of black water that reflected nothing. This was land that killed casually, that broke wagons and swallowed cattle and turned men's bones to dust. Caleb rode for 6 hours until the horse's sides heaved and his own hands shook with exhaustion. Dawn was a gray suggestion on the eastern horizon when he heard the dogs. Faint at first, a sound that might have been wind or imagination. Then louder. Definitely dogs, hunting dogs with voices like broken bells baying across the open country. Thomas Garrett had wasted no time. Caleb urged Ashes into a coulee, a narrow canyon that cut deep into the earth. The walls rose 50 feet on either side, casting shadows that felt like temporary mercy. He dismounted, led the horse deeper into the cut, and tried to think. The dogs would be on his trail within hours. Wolf Garrett would be with them. 6 men, probably all armed, all willing to shoot a horse thief on sight and claim the law was on their side. $50 bounty for bringing him back alive. 25 for his body. He needed to hide, needed to disappear so completely that even dogs couldn't find him. That's when he saw the boxcar. It lay on its side in a snowbank from last winter's melt, 34 feet of wood and metal, that the Northern Pacific Railroad had deemed too expensive to recover. Spring floods had derailed it, sent it tumbling into this coulee where it had settled like a beached ship. The railroad had written it off, left it to rust. Caleb approached slowly. The boxcar's sliding doors still worked, grinding open on rails that screamed protest. Inside was darkness that smelled of grain and rust and abandonment. The floor was tongue and groove lumber, solid beneath his boots. The walls were wood planking over a metal frame, and when Caleb pressed his hand against them, he felt the iron beneath. The exterior shell was sheet metal, a weather shield. He could see it where the wooden interior had pulled away gaps, showing the iron skeleton underneath. This was shelter. Crude shelter, but shelter nonetheless. It would also be a death trap come winter. Everyone knew you couldn't heat metal. The coal would bleed through that iron shell faster than any fire could fight it. But that was months away. Right now, winter was the least of Caleb's problems. He led Ashes deeper into the coulee, tied her in a thicket of brush, where she'd be hidden from anyone riding the rim. Then he climbed into the boxcar, pulled the door mostly shut, and waited. The dogs arrived an hour later. Caleb heard them baying, heard the thunder of horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth above the coulee. Voices drifted down, distorted by distance and stone. Dogs lost the scent at the river. That was Pete Rollins. Kid must have gone upstream. Or he's hiding. Thomas Garrett's voice carried the kind of confidence that came from never having consequences. Fan out. Check every cave, every overhang. He's on foot now. Probably tried to hide the horse and hole up somewhere. Caleb's heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack ribs. He'd climbed into the rafters of the boxcar, wedged himself into the darkest corner where the ceiling met the wall. Below him, the floor was empty. The walls were bare. If someone looked inside quickly, they'd see nothing. Bootfalls approached. Heavy, deliberate. Pete Rollins appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against morning light. He stood there for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Looked at the empty floor. Looked at the walls. Banged his fist against the metal exterior. The sound rang like a bell. Anything, Thomas called from somewhere above. Just an empty wreck. Been here since spring. Keep moving. Pete spat tobacco juice onto the boxcar floor and walked away. The hunting party moved south, dogs and men, and the casual certainty that they'd find their prey before sundown. Caleb stayed in the rafters for 30 minutes after the last sounds faded. When he finally climbed down, his legs shook so badly he had to sit on the floor and breathe. He'd escaped. For now. But he couldn't leave this coulee. The Garretts would have men watching the roads east back to Medora. The railroad west to Sentinel Butte would have station agents who'd been told to watch for a fugitive. North was Sioux territory, where a white boy alone would last about as long as a match in a windstorm. South was open badlands, waterless, merciless. He was trapped, maybe for days, maybe for weeks. Trapped in a coulee 3 miles from the town that wanted him hanged with 45 cents a hunting knife, his father had slipped into his pocket in a notebook full of his dead mother's engineering sketches. Caleb pulled out the notebook, opened it to a page he'd read 100 times. A root cellar design his mother had drawn, showing double walls with a 6-inch gap between them. The space was filled with straw. The diagram showed arrows indicating heat flow, or rather, the lack of it. Still air doesn't conduct, she'd written. Moving air steals warmth. But if you trap the air so it can't move, it becomes insulation. The key is stopping the movement. Dead air is dead to heat transfer. Caleb looked at the boxcar's interior, looked at the gap where the wooden planking had pulled away from the iron shell. 4 inches of empty space. He pressed his hand against the wood, then against the metal. The wood was warmer. Not warm, but warmer than the iron. An idea formed. Fragile as spider silk at first, then stronger as he thought it through. What if he built a second wall inside the boxcar? A wooden room with a gap between it and the metal shell? What if he filled that gap with grass or straw, creating a layer of still air? The iron exterior would stop the wind completely. No sod house could do that. Wind found every crack in sod, every gap where the earth hadn't been packed tight. But this metal shell was continuous. Perfect. An absolute wind barrier. Inside that shell, he could build a smaller room. Heat that smaller space instead of the entire boxcar. Use the gap as insulation the way his mother's root cellar used straw. Everyone said you couldn't heat metal, but what if you didn't heat the metal? What if you heated the air inside it and trapped it there? Caleb stood in the boxcar doorway and looked at the coulee walls rising around him. 3 miles from Medora, hidden, abandoned. Exactly the kind of place no one would look for a fugitive who had any sense, which meant it was perfect. He had no axe, no saw, no hammer. He had a knife 45 cents and the kind of anger that came from watching your father choose silence over justice. But he also had his mother's notebooks. And those notebooks were filled with solutions to problems everyone else thought were impossible. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere to the east, the hunting party was searching gullies and caves. Somewhere in Medora, Thomas Garrett was placing bets on when they'd find Caleb Morrison's frozen body. Caleb pulled the boxcar door shut and began to plan. 10 days passed before another soul found him. 10 days of scavenging wood from wrecked freight pallets near the railroad. 10 days of hauling cottonwood poles from the river bottom, dragging them up slopes that turned his shoulders into hamburger and his hands into bleeding ruins. 10 days of learning that a knife could be a saw if you were patient, a hammer if you were desperate, and absolutely useless for cutting through iron if you were stupid enough to try. He'd framed 2 walls by the time Harold Dawson appeared at the rim of the coulee. The section foreman for this stretch of the Northern Pacific stood there like a monument to weariness, 52 years old, and every one of them visible in the lines of his face. He'd worked the railroad since 1875, had survived 11 Dakota winters, had pulled 3 frozen bodies from snowdrifts along his section of track. Harold Dawson knew what death looked like before it arrived. And when he looked down at Caleb Morrison standing in the doorway of a wrecked boxcar with a crude wooden frame visible behind him, his expression said he was looking at a corpse that just didn't know it yet. "What are you doing here, boy?" Caleb straightened. He'd lost weight. Could feel it in how his pants hung loose, how his belt needed a new notch. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from his shirt, but blood still seeped through where blisters had burst and torn. Staying alive. Harold walked his horse down the slope, slow and careful, the way you approached anything that might spook. When he got close enough, Caleb saw the man's eyes, gray as winter sky, holding nothing but a vast, tired pragmatism. "You're the Morrison kid, the one they say stole Wolf Garrett's horse." "I didn't steal anything." "Guilty or innocent doesn't matter out here." Harold dismounted, tied his horse to a scrub pine that looked like it had been trying to die for a decade. "What matters is whether you survive till someone cares about the difference." He walked to the boxcar, looked inside at the frame Caleb had built. 2 walls stood at right angles, rough lumber, scavenged from broken freight crates, joined with wooden pegs because Caleb didn't have nails. A 3rd wall was half-framed. The 4th existed only in Caleb's head. "You planning to winter here?" "If I have to. You'll need a proper shelter." Harold's voice held the flat certainty of a man who'd seen this story before. "That iron shell is a death trap. Cold goes right through metal, like water through cloth. You'll need 8 cords of wood, minimum. A stove. Food stores." He looked at Caleb, really looked, taking in the bleeding hands and the weight loss and the kind of stubborn stupid that got young men killed in the territories. "A boy alone on the run with no tools. You won't last till Christmas. When they find you in spring, the coyotes will have scattered what's left across the coulee." Caleb picked up his mother's notebook from where it sat on a makeshift workbench made from an overturned crate, opened it to the root cellar design, held it out. "My mother was a blacksmith's daughter. She understood heat transfer better than most engineers. This boxcar isn't a shelter. It's a forge shell. I don't heat the metal, I heat the air inside it." Harold took the notebook, studied the drawings. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. The kind of shift that happened when a man who'd seen everything suddenly saw something new. "Explain." "I built a wooden room inside the boxcar, 16 feet by 7 feet instead of the full 34 by 8. Half the volume means half the heat loss. I frame it 6 inches away from the metal shell. Fill that gap with dry grass. The grass traps the air. Still, air can't carry heat. The metal exterior stops the wind absolutely. No gap, no crack, no way for the wind to get through. And when moisture condenses on the cold metal, canvas against the iron, catches the frost before it reaches the wooden walls." Harold handed back the notebook, looked at the boxcar again, at the frame Caleb had built, at the boy who should have been running for Montana but was instead building walls in a wreck everyone else had abandoned. "I've seen smarter men than you freeze to death trying clever ideas," Harold said. "But I've also pulled 3 bodies out of proper cabins that followed all the rules. So maybe the rules are wrong." He turned to leave, then stopped. "I'll be back in a month. If you're still alive, I'll stop calling you stupid." "Is that a promise?" "It's a bet." Harold swung into his saddle. "And I don't bet on death. Bad luck." He rode up out of the coulee, disappeared over the rim, left Caleb alone with his half-built walls and his mother's notebook and the slowly growing certainty that he'd committed to something that would either save his life or kill him, and the answer wouldn't come until winter was deep enough to make changing his mind impossible. Caleb worked through August into September. Every day was a calculus of risk. He needed nails to properly join the wallboards. The only place to get nails was Medora. The only way to get to Medora was to risk being recognized. He waited for a Saturday, market day, when the town would be full of ranchers and farmers and enough strange faces that one more wouldn't stand out. He rode Ashes in the pre-dawn darkness, tied her a mile outside town, and walked in wearing a hat pulled low in 3 weeks of dirt that changed his face. The ironmonger's shop smelled like metal and oil. The owner, an old man named Bill Hutchins, looked at Caleb with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by a dirty hat. "You look familiar, boy." "I have that kind of face." How many nails?" "5 pounds, assorted sizes." 35 cents. Caleb counted out coins that left him with 10 cents to his name. Bill bagged the nails in brown paper, handed them over, and that's when Pete Rollins walked through the door. Caleb turned his back, pretended to examine a shelf of horseshoes. His heart tried to climb out through his throat. Pete walked to the counter, ordered ammunition, and while Bill fetched it from the back room, stood 3 feet from Caleb, humming some tuneless song. "Bill," Pete called when the old man returned. "You seen any strangers lately?" Young guy, dark hair, about 18. "Strangers come and go." Why? "Wolf's still looking for that horse thief, $50 reward." Caleb picked up a horseshoe, examined it like he knew what he was looking for, and started toward the door. Pete turned, looked directly at him. 3 seconds of eye contact that felt like standing on a gallows. Then Pete looked away, back to Bill, back to his ammunition. Caleb walked out, walked down the main street, walked past the sheriff's office where he'd been held, walked until he was past the last building, then he ran. Ran until his lungs burned, ran until he was back where he'd hidden Ashes. Only then did he stop. Only then did he sit on the ground and shake. Pete hadn't recognized him. 3 weeks of weight loss and sun damage and fear had changed him enough. He didn't look like the blacksmith's son anymore. He looked like something the Badlands had chewed and spat out. He looked like a survivor. By the time October arrived with its first taste of winter, Oisab had 4 walls standing. The frame was complete rough lumber joined with nails he'd bought with his last coins. The gap between his inner walls and the boxcar's metal shell stood empty, waiting for the grass he hadn't had time to gather. The ceiling was half-framed. He'd cut a hole through the boxcar's metal roof for a stovepipe he didn't have using his knife, and 3 days of patient work that left his hands bleeding. He had no stove. That was the problem that kept him awake nights. A stove cost $4.50. He had 10 cents. No amount of labor he could trade would earn that much, and even if he could earn it, he couldn't leave the coulee long enough to work. The answer came from the railroad dump pile. Caleb found it on a cold morning when frost painted the grass white. Behind the Medora Depot, the Northern Pacific kept a heap of broken equipment, damaged tools, worn-out parts, things not worth shipping east for repair. Buried under a collapsed crate, Caleb found a small sheet iron stove with a crack running across the firebox like a scar. The crack was why it had been thrown away. A cracked firebox leaked smoke. In a normal cabin, that meant a room full of fumes. But Caleb's design wasn't normal. In a fully enclosed space with controlled ventilation, a stovepipe through the roof, and an intake gap at the door, a smoke leak was manageable. He remembered his father teaching him to patch cracked iron. "Clay and ash, son, 50-50 mix, pack it in while it's cool, let it cure, fire it slow. The heat hardens the clay like pottery." The memory hurt. His father's voice teaching him something useful back when Samuel Morrison still taught instead of surrendered. But the stove wasn't free. It belonged to the railroad. Taking it would be theft. Caleb found Harold Dawson at the section house mending a broken rail jack. The old man looked up when Caleb approached, and something in his posture suggested he wasn't entirely surprised to see the Morrison boy still breathing. "Came to take that ride to Dickinson," I offered, Harold asked. "There's a stove in your dump pile, cracked firebox. No good for a normal cabin. I want it." "That thing's useless. Fill a room with smoke before it warmed a mouse." "I don't need to warm a room. I need to warm a box inside a box." Harold set down the rail jack, studied Caleb with those winter gray eyes. The boy had lost maybe 15 pounds since August. His face was sharper. His hands were wrapped in rags that didn't fully hide the cracked and bleeding knuckles. But his eyes were the same as they'd been a month ago. Clear, steady, absolutely unwilling to quit. "What do you want for it?" Caleb asked. Harold could have given it to him. The stove was trash worth nothing to the railroad. But he understood something in that moment. A gift would insult this boy, would suggest charity, pity, weakness. "Wash my clothes for a month," Harold said. "Sundays. I'll provide the soap." Done. Harold hauled the stove to the coulee himself. It was the first time he'd been back since August, and what he saw made him stop at the rim and stare. The boxcar was transformed. Where there had been an empty shell, there was now a structure within a structure. Wooden walls standing 6 inches from the metal exterior. A ceiling frame creating a second air gap below the boxcar's roof. An inner door waiting to seal the living space. Everything rough-hewn and imperfect, but everything there. "You built all this with scrap and rocks?" Harold asked when he'd helped Caleb wrestle the stove inside. "And stubbornness. Your mother would have been proud." Harold paused at the boxcar door. "The crack. Patch it with clay and ash. 50-50. "I know." "And Caleb." The old man looked back. "This is still the easy part. What's coming? I don't know if what you built will hold. Nobody does. And by the time you find out, it'll be too late to change anything." He left. Caleb stood in the boxcar doorway watching him climb the slope and disappear over the rim, and for the first time since August, he let himself believe he might actually survive until spring. The first snow came on October 19th, an inch that melted by noon, but the message was clear. Winter was no longer a distant threat. It was a promise the sky intended to keep. Caleb stood in the boxcar doorway and watched the white fade from the coulee floor, leaving only mud and the kind of cold that bit through cloth. He'd completed the 4 inner walls. The ceiling frame was 3/4 finished, but the 6-inch gap between his wooden room and the metal shell stood empty, waiting for grass he hadn't gathered because he'd been too busy cutting wood he didn't have enough of. He pulled out his mother's notebook and did the math again, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. The inner room measured 16 feet by 7 feet, 112 square feet. At normal cabin temperatures, that would need maybe 2 cords of wood to heat through a Dakota winter. But this wasn't a normal cabin. This was an experimental design that might work brilliantly or fail catastrophically, and he wouldn't know which until the temperature dropped low enough to kill him if he'd guessed wrong. He had 1.5 cords cut. Needed at least 2.5 to be safe. 3 would be better. The cottonwood along the river was playing out. The easy pickings were gone. What remained required real tools, real strength, and real time he was rapidly running out of. October 26 brought 3 inches of snow. This time it didn't melt. Caleb woke to white silence and a temperature that had dropped to 20 degrees overnight. He'd slept in every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped in a canvas tarp, and still woken shivering. The inner room was complete now, walls and ceiling, both, but without insulation in the gaps and without a fire in the stove. It was just a wooden box inside a metal box, and both boxes were cold. He lit a small fire using scraps of wood too small to save for winter, just enough to take the edge off to stop his hands shaking long enough to work. The stove sat in the corner installed, but untested, its cracked firebox packed with the clay and ash mixture his father had taught him to make. The patch needed 3 more days to cure before he dared light a real fire. 3 days. He could survive 3 more days of cold. He'd survived worse. That morning he started filling the gaps. Martha Blackwell had told him about the Peterson place when he'd brought her Sunday washing the week before. "Family left for Minnesota last year," she'd said, counting out potatoes as payment. "There's a haystack still standing. Molded on the outside, but if you dig deep, the center should be dry." 3 miles south, Caleb made the trip on foot leading ashes because the old mare deserved better than carrying a man's weight over rough ground. The Peterson homestead sat abandoned windows, dark door hanging crooked. The haystack was exactly where Martha said, a decomposing mound that looked like it had been there since Genesis. The outer layer was black with rot, but when Caleb dug in with his hands, pulled away the spoiled material, he found gold underneath. Dry grass, still sweet-smelling, packed tight by its own weight. He filled a burlap sack he'd scavenged from the railroad. 40 pounds of grass that he carried on his back, stumbling over frozen ground, stopping every 50 yards because his legs threatened to quit. 3 hours to get there. 3 hours back. 8 feet of gap filled. He needed 120 linear feet filled, 6 inches wide, 6 feet tall. 14 more trips. 5 more days of hauling grass while his body consumed itself because he was eating too little and working too hard and sleeping less than he should. But the alternative was freezing, so he hauled. On the third trip, his shoulder started bleeding where the burlap sack rubbed. On the fifth trip, he had to stop twice as often. On the seventh trip, he fell and lay in the frozen grass for 10 minutes before he found the strength to stand. His body was failing. He could feel it in the way his hands shook, the way his vision went gray at the edges when he stood too fast. He'd lost weight he didn't have to lose. His pants hung loose despite the belt cinched to its last hole. His shirt draped like it was hanging on a scarecrow. But he kept hauling. On the 14th trip, the last trip, Caleb's arms shook so badly he dropped the bundle twice. When he finally stuffed the last section of gap with grass, when he packed it tight and stepped back to see the walls complete, sealed, insulated, he sat on the floor and cried. Not from relief, from exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. He let himself cry for maybe a minute. Then he stood up, wiped his face with hands that were more callous than skin, and began chinching every crack with mud he'd dug from the riverbank. The mud was mixed with grass, fibers would dry hard, as concrete would seal gaps a mouse couldn't squeeze through. By the time he finished, the sun had set. November had arrived, and Caleb Morrison had built walls that would either save his life or become his tomb. The stove's clay patch had cured for 5 days when Caleb finally lit the first real fire. November 5th, the temperature outside had dropped to 14 degrees. Inside the unheated room, it was maybe 20. Cold enough to see his breath. Cold enough that his fingers fumbled with the kindling. He started small, twigs and dry grass building a flame that wouldn't stress the patch too quickly. The fire caught, grew. Smoke poured from the crack in the firebox for the first 30 minutes, making Caleb's eyes water. But as the stove heated, the clay contracted, sealed tighter. The smoke diminished. After an hour, it was just a thin haze. After 2 hours, almost nothing. The patch was holding. Caleb fed larger pieces of wood into the firebox, watched the flames grow steady and strong. Heat radiated from the cast iron. He closed the inner door, sealing his wooden room, and waited. After 30 minutes, he could feel the difference. The air wasn't warm yet, but it wasn't Arctic. After an hour, he took off his outer coat. After 2 hours, he was down to 2 shirts instead of 4. He checked the thermometer he'd bought with his last 10 cents, a battered mercury instrument that had probably lied about temperature for 20 years, but it was better than guessing. Outside, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the wooden room, 52 degrees, a 38-degree difference, and he'd burned less than half a cord's worth of wood. Caleb pressed his hand against the inner wall. Warm. Not hot, but genuinely warm. He reached into the gap as far as he could, felt the grass insulation. Cool, but not cold. He pressed his hand against the canvas he'd hung against the metal shell. Ice cold, frost already forming on the fabric, but the frost was on the canvas, not in his room. The moisture was condensing where he'd planned for it to condense. The cold was being held at bay by still air and dead grass and a design his mother had sketched for a root cellar 10 years ago. The design worked. In November, at 14 degrees. But this wasn't winter. This was autumn with a cold edge. Real winter meant 40 below. Meant blizzards that buried cattle standing upright. Meant cold that killed men in their beds. That test was still coming. Martha Blackwell visited in mid-November, bringing cornbread wrapped in cloth as payment for washing. She stepped into Caleb's inner room and stood there for a long moment, looking around at the rough lumber, the mud-chinked walls, the small stove radiating heat. "It's warm," she said, and there was surprise in her voice. "Warmer than my cabin. That's the point. But this isn't winter, Caleb. This is autumn. Wait till January. Wait till 40 below comes and stays for a week. That metal shell will be a frozen tomb. Maybe. Maybe isn't good enough. Maybe is all I have." Martha studied him with eyes that had seen too many winters, buried too many hopes. "I lost a brother in the winter of '81. He thought he was ready too. They found him 20 feet from his cabin door. Went out for firewood and couldn't find his way back in the whiteout." She set the cornbread on his makeshift table, a plank across 2 sawhorses. "Winter doesn't care how clever you are. It only cares if you're strong enough." "Then I'll be strong enough." Martha left, but at the door she turned back. "There's a betting pool in town. Men wagering on when you'll freeze. Most have you dead by Christmas. A few generous will give you till New Year's. What did you bet? I don't bet on death, but if I did, I'd bet on spring. You're too stubborn to die easy. 2 days later, the betting pool came to Caleb in person. A ranch hand named Hank Miller rode to the rim of the coulee and called down. Heard about you, Morrison. Betting pool in Medora says you don't make Christmas. I put $1 on New Year's. Figured I'd give you the benefit of the doubt. Caleb stood in the boxcar doorway and said nothing. Wolf's got Thanksgiving. Hank laughed. Says the cold will get you before the turkey does. Harold Dawson won't bet. Says it's bad luck to wager on death. Hank rode off still laughing. Caleb went back inside and sat by the stove feeding it small pieces of wood, watching the flames dance. They were betting on his death. Men he'd never met were wagering money on whether he'd see January. It should have made him angry, should have made him want to prove them wrong just for spite. Instead, it made him think about revenge. Thomas Garrett had framed him for horse theft, had stood by while his father sentenced Caleb to hang, had organized a manhunt, and now he was betting money on Caleb's death like it was a horse race. When spring came, when Caleb rode back into Medora alive, he wasn't just going to clear his name. He was going to make Wolf Garrett answer for everything he'd done. Revenge was a fire that burned hotter than any stove, and Caleb fed it every day. The ice storm hit on November 16th. Caleb woke to a sound like 1,000 fingernails tapping on metal. Sleet driven by wind hammering the boxcar's iron shell. By noon, everything was glazed. The grass, the rocks, the bare branches of cottonwoods. All of it coated in ice a quarter-inch thick. The ice meant cattle couldn't eat. The grass was there visible, but locked behind a frozen crust they couldn't break. Over the next 3 weeks, ranchers would lose 10% of their herds. By spring, they'd lose 90%. But those numbers weren't known yet. Right now, the ice was just an inconvenience. For Caleb, it was worse. Gathering wood became treacherous. Every step was a gamble. Every surface wanted to throw him down. On the third day of the storm, he slipped on an ice-slicked rock and went down hard. His knee cracked against stone. The bruise spread black across his kneecap, painful enough to make him limp for a week. But he kept cutting wood, kept hauling it back to the boxcar, kept adding to the pile that was still too small, would always be too small unless he could somehow cut faster than winter was coming. He couldn't. Winter was winning. The gap between what he had and what he needed was closing, and not in his favor. December 4th brought the first major blizzard. 18 inches of snow in 20 hours. Drifts reaching 6 feet against the boxcar's exposed side. Caleb couldn't leave his shelter for 2 days. Couldn't even open the outer door without snow cascading in. He sat in his wooden room feeding the stove, carefully rationing wood, and discovered something unexpected. The snow that had buried half the boxcar was acting as insulation. The drifts banking against the metal shell added another layer between the cold outside and the warmth inside. His room temperature held steady at 47 degrees while he burned less wood than he'd calculated. The coulee's location, which everyone had said was a death trap, was actually working in his favor. The drifts built up around the boxcar instead of burying it completely. The snow insulated instead of smothered. Maybe he'd get lucky. Maybe the math would work after all. On the second day of the blizzard, the temperature outside hit -8. Caleb sat by the stove and did the calculations in his mother's notebook, adding up what he had versus what he needed. Wood remaining 1 3/4 cords. At current burn rate, 12 weeks of fuel. Winter's worst cold ran from mid-December through February. Roughly 10 weeks. The math almost worked. Almost. But almost was where people died. When the blizzard finally broke on December 7th, Caleb emerged into a world transformed. The coulee was buried under snow that had sculpted itself into shapes that looked like frozen waves. The cottonwoods along the river were bent and broken. The sky was the color of old pewter, but smoke was rising from his stovepipe, and Caleb Morrison was alive. He used the break in weather to cut more wood. A false thaw arrived in early January, temperatures climbing to 28 degrees on January 6th. The sun broke through clouds for the first time in weeks. Caleb seized the opportunity like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. He cut wood with a fury he hadn't known he possessed. Worked from dawn until his hands were too numb to grip the improvised axe. Hauled loads that made his shoulders scream. Added a quarter cord to his pile. He checked his rabbit snares and found a rabbit. 2 squirrels. Protein he desperately needed. His body was consuming itself. He could see ribs now when he washed, could count vertebrae. His face had gone gaunt, eyes sunk deep, cheekbones sharp enough to cut. But he was adding to his stores. Wood, food, time. By January 8th, he had 2 cords of wood, food for 5 weeks if he was careful, a shelter that was holding. For the first time since August, he thought he might actually survive this. That evening, the sky turned green-gray. Caleb had never seen that color before, but something primal in his spine recognized it as danger. The cattle still alive on the open range began moving east, as if pushed by something coming from the west. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. Harold Dawson appeared at the coulee's rim just before sunset. He didn't dismount, just sat on his horse and called down. "If you have anything to do outside, do it now." "What's coming?" "I saw it once before, in '81, killed 40% of the cattle in the territory, killed men in their beds." Harold looked at the thread of smoke rising from Caleb's stovepipe. "Stay inside no matter what you hear. Don't go out even if you think you hear someone calling. The wind plays tricks." "How long will it last?" "Could be 3 days, could be a week." Harold gathered his reins. "If you survive this, I'll stop saying you'll die." "Is that a promise?" "It's a bet, and I told you I don't bet on death." He rode away into the strange light. Caleb watched him disappear over the rim, then looked west. The wall of green-gray stretched from horizon to horizon, a bruise spreading across the sky. Caleb spent the next hour preparing. He brought in every piece of wood he could fit in the small room, filled every container he had with water from the river breaking through a skim of ice to reach it, checked the stovepipe seal, checked the door seals, checked the clay patch on the firebox. Then he went inside, closed the outer door, closed the inner door, sat by the stove, and waited. The temperature was 31 degrees above zero at 3 in the afternoon on January 9th, 1887. By nightfall, it would be 15 below. By midnight, 26 below. By dawn, 40 below, and falling. Harold Dawson, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and pulled 3 frozen bodies from snowdrifts, had told an 18-year-old fugitive in August that a boy alone wouldn't last till Christmas. Caleb Morrison had escaped a noose, built a home from scraps, survived on stubbornness and engineering. But the blizzard coming didn't care about any of that. It only cared about killing everything in its path. The storm hit at 3:17 in the afternoon like a door slamming. Caleb heard it before he felt it, a sound like a freight train, a roar that built and built until it swallowed every other noise. Then the boxcar shuddered. The metal shell rang like a struck bell. Snow began hissing against the exterior, not falling but driving sideways, propelled by winds that would later be measured at 50 miles per hour. Inside the sealed inner room, Caleb sat by the stove, hands shaking, not from cold, from the sound. It was the sound of something alive, something hunting. The temperature began to plummet. 31 degrees at 3, 18 by 4, 12 by 5, 6 by 6, 0 by 9. The mercury was falling so fast Caleb could almost watch it drop. He fed the stove carefully. Not too much wood, or he'd run out. Not too little, or the room would freeze. A careful balance between survival and death measured in sticks of cottonwood and the uncertain science of a design no one had ever tested. At 11 that night, the temperature outside hit -15. Inside his wooden room, Caleb maintained 46 degrees. He was burning wood faster than he'd planned. At this rate, 2 cords would last maybe 8 days. The storm could last longer. He made a decision, let the temperature drop, 46 to 44 to 42. Cold, genuinely cold, but not fatal. He could be uncomfortable. He'd been uncomfortable before. He wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned, topped with Martha's wool blanket in the canvas tarp. He looked like a refugee from a war nobody won, but he was warm enough to not die, and not dying was victory. Dawn on January 10th never really came. The sun tried to rise somewhere beyond the wall of white, but the snow was so thick, so fine that it blotted out light itself. The world beyond the boxcar door was a void. No definition, no depth, just white that moved and screamed and wanted in. Caleb woke to cold that felt personal. The temperature inside his room had dropped to 38 degrees during the night. Outside, according to the thermometer he'd mounted near the outer door, it was negative 40. 40 below zero, the kind of cold that had its own physics. At 40 below, exposed flesh froze in under 2 minutes. At 40 below, the air itself felt solid, a weight that pressed against your chest and made each breath an act of will. At 40 below, moisture in your eyes could freeze if you blinked too slowly. Caleb fed the stove, watching precious wood disappear into flames. The heat radiated outward, pushing the cold back to the walls, but it was a battle the stove was barely winning. He'd let the fire die down too much during the night. The room temperature had dropped dangerously close to freezing. He couldn't let that happen again. Once a space this small got truly cold, warming it back up consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Better to maintain a livable temperature than to let it crash and try to recover. But maintaining meant burning wood faster, and burning wood faster meant running out sooner. The math was turning against him. By noon on the 10th, the temperature outside had somehow dropped further. Negative 42. The boxcar's metal shell rang with each gust of wind, a sound like distant bells or breaking glass. Inside his wooden room, Caleb kept the temperature at 40 degrees, cold enough to see his breath, warm enough to not die. He ate sparingly, a piece of dried rabbit, some of Martha's cornbread that had gone hard as stone but was still food, water from the bucket that had a skim of ice despite being inside. His body wanted more, wanted heat that came from burning calories. But he had to ration, had to make everything last because he didn't know when this storm would end. The wind screamed. That was the only word for it. Not howling, not blowing, screaming, like something alive and in pain clawing at the iron shell trying to get in. Caleb sat by the stove and thought about his mother. Wondered if she'd ever imagined her drawings being used like this. Wondered if she'd be proud or horrified that her son was gambling his life on theories she'd sketched in the margins of notebooks. He thought about his father too, about Samuel Morrison sitting in that courtroom gallery silent, about the coins pressed into Caleb's hand, the notebook, the horse, the window bars loosened in the night. His father had been a coward when it mattered most, but he'd also given Caleb the tools to survive. That had to count for something. Didn't it? The storm's second day was worse than the first. The temperature held at negative 40 or below for 16 straight hours. Caleb burned through a quarter quart of wood, maintaining 40 degrees inside his room. At this rate, he had maybe 6 days of fuel left, 6 days, and the storm showed no sign of breaking. He reduced the fire even further, let the room temperature drop to 38, then 36. His fingers went numb inside gloves. His feet ached with cold despite 2 pairs of socks. But 36 was still above freezing, still survivable. He wrapped himself in layers and thought about Thomas Garrett, sitting in some warm house in Medora, collecting bets on when Caleb Morrison would freeze to death. Thought about riding back into town come spring and watching Wolf's face when a dead man walked through his door. Revenge was a good fire. It burned clean and hot and didn't consume wood. On the morning of January 11th, someone knocked on the outer door. Caleb heard it through the howl of wind. 3 deliberate impacts, metal on metal. He sat up from where he'd been dozing by the stove, heart hammering. It had to be the wind. Harold had warned him. The wind played tricks, made sounds like voices, like footsteps, like knocking. But the sound came again. Bang, bang, bang. Rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was out there. Caleb's first instinct was to stay inside. Opening the door meant losing heat, meant exposing himself to cold that could kill in minutes. Harold had said, don't go out no matter what you hear. But Harold had also said the wind played tricks. This didn't sound like wind. This sounded like someone dying. Caleb made a decision he'd either regret or remember as the moment he proved he wasn't like the men who'd abandoned him. He opened the inner door, crawled through the dark space between walls, reached the outer door and pulled it open. Snow cascaded in. Wind hit him like a fist, and in that wind, collapsed against the boxcar's side, was Edward Blackwell. Martha's husband was maybe 6 feet tall, maybe 180 when he was healthy. Now he looked like something the storm had chewed and spat out. His skin was gray. His lips were blue. Both hands were white as candle wax fingers, stiff and waxy with frostbite. His left ear had frozen solid. Caleb didn't think. Thinking would have meant calculating odds, weighing risks, deciding whether saving one man was worth risking two lives. He just grabbed Edward under the arms and pulled. 180 pounds of dead weight. Caleb weighed maybe 150 now, most of it bone and stubborn. But he pulled, dragged Edward over the lip of the boxcar door, pulled him across the outer chamber, pulled him into the inner room and kicked the door shut behind them. The wind's scream cut off. Silence rushed in, broken only by Edward's shallow breathing and Caleb's own gasps. Caleb built the fire higher than he'd allowed himself in days. The room temperature climbed. 42, 46, 50. He wrapped Edward in every blanket and piece of cloth he had, knowing that warming frozen flesh too quickly could kill as surely as the cold itself. For an hour, Edward didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed those shallow, rattling breaths that said his body was trying to decide whether to quit or fight. Then his eyes opened, confused at first, then aware. "Martha," he whispered, "the children. Your family's in your cabin. You're 3 miles from home. You came out in the storm and collapsed." Edward tried to sit up, failed, tried again. "I have to go back. You step out that door, you die 50 feet from here. And then I wasted wood keeping you alive for nothing." Edward stared at him, at the boy everyone in Medora thought was a horse thief, the fugitive, the fool who was supposed to freeze in an iron box. "Why did you pull me in?" "Because I know what it's like when people leave you to die." Caleb fed another piece of wood into the stove. "And I'm not them." Edward was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. "I was at that trial. I knew Wolf was lying, but I didn't speak up." "Why not?" "Because I have a family to protect. Standing up to the Garretts is a good way to lose everything." Edward looked at his hands, at the white fingers that would soon turn black. "Looks like I'm losing things anyway." Over the next 3 days, Caleb learned things about frostbite his mother's notebooks hadn't covered. He learned that frozen flesh turned white, then gray, then black. He learned that you couldn't rub it or warm it too fast. He learned that willow bark tea helped with pain, but only barely. He learned that 2 men in a room generated more heat than one, which helped. But 2 men also consumed more food and water and space. Edward's right hand lost 2 fingers to frostbite. The black spread up from the tips, clear and certain as a death sentence. The left hand might keep all its fingers, but they'd be useless. The ear was gone completely. "Martha's going to kill me," Edward said on the second day, looking at his hands. "Martha's going to be happy you're alive." "You don't know Martha." But Edward smiled when he said it, and Caleb understood. Some anger was just love that didn't know where else to go. On the morning of January 14th, Caleb woke to smoke. Not the thin haze from the stove's patched crack. Thick smoke, acrid, choking, filling the room so fast he couldn't see the far wall. The crack had opened again. 5 days of constant heat had stressed the clay patch. It had crumbled. Smoke was pouring into the room instead of up the stovepipe. They had minutes, maybe less. In a sealed space, smoke inhalation killed faster than cold. Caleb pulled burning wood from the stove with his bare hands. The metal firebox seared his palms. He would have blisters for weeks, scars probably. But he didn't stop. Threw the logs onto the dirt floor. Stamped out flames. "Open the door," Edward shouted, coughing. "Let it clear. Open the door and we lose all the heat. 46 below outside. We'd never get the temperature back up." Caleb scraped the crumbled clay from the crack with his knife, working by feel because he couldn't see. Mixed new clay with ash scooped from the floor, still hot enough to burn, packed it into the crack, pressed it firm, held it in place while his lungs screamed and his eyes streamed tears. The smoke began to thin. The draft through the stovepipe reasserted itself. In 10 minutes, the air was breathable. In 15, he had the fire rebuilt. The room temperature had dropped to 34 degrees during the crisis, 2 degrees above freezing. Another few minutes and they would have crossed that line. And once a room froze, warming it back up would have consumed more wood than Caleb had left. He'd fixed the problem. Barely. Wood remaining half a cord, maybe 5 days of fuel if he was careful, if the storm broke, if the temperature rose, if. Edward watched him work with something like awe. "I thought you were a fool," he said, "a kid playing at survival." "Everyone did. I was wrong. You're tougher than men twice your age. Caleb looked at his burned hands at the blisters already forming. Tough or desperate? I can't tell the difference anymore. On the morning of January 15th, Caleb woke to silence. After 6 days of constant wind, constant roar, constant pressure against the iron shell, silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence. He opened the inner door, opened the outer door. Snow had drifted 8 feet high against the south side of the boxcar, but the sky above was blue, clear blue, the kind of blue that looked like hope if you squinted. The temperature was -22. After -46, it felt warm. Caleb stepped out of the boxcar for the first time in 6 days. The cold bit his face, but he didn't care. He walked to the rim of the coulee and looked toward the Blackwell homestead 2 miles north. Smoke, thin but present. Martha had survived. The children had survived. He looked south toward the Murphy claim. No smoke. That family's story would end differently. When he turned back to the boxcar, Edward was standing in the doorway wrapped in blankets, hands bandaged but alive. Storm's over, Caleb said. I heard. Edward's voice was rough. Thank you for taking me in, for keeping me alive. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just went back inside and started building up the fire again because the storm might be over, but winter wasn't, and they still had to survive until spring. 3 days after the storm broke, Harold Dawson came to the coulee. He'd been working the railroad line, clearing snow, documenting damage, counting the dead. His face was gray with exhaustion. His eyes held nothing but weariness and the kind of knowledge that came from seeing too much death. He stopped at the rim and stared down at the boxcar. Smoke rose from the stovepipe. The structure was half buried in drifted snow, but it was intact, unbroken. Harold walked down the slope and knocked on the outer door. Caleb opened it. Behind him, Edward Blackwell sat wrapped in blankets, bandaged, hands visible, face pale but alive. Harold looked at them both for a long moment. I've pulled frozen bodies out of proper cabins with 8 cords of wood stacked, he said finally. Men who knew what they were doing, families with everything they needed. He looked at the walls, at the grass poking from the waste, at the small stove with its patched firebox. I told you you'd be dead by Christmas. I told you that iron box would be your coffin. He took a breath. I was wrong. You figured out something I didn't know. That air pocket, the grass in the gap. I never would have thought of it. You're alive because you didn't listen to me. The others who died, Caleb said. Did any of them have what I had? The iron shells, no. Then they never had a chance. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. Harold nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud. Your father. He paused. Your father's a coward, but you're not. On January 20th, Martha Blackwell came to collect her husband. She'd walked 2 miles through thigh-deep snow, leaving her children with a neighbor to find the man she thought was dead. When she saw Edward sitting up alive, she cried. The first emotion Caleb had seen her show in 5 months. But then she looked around at the inner room. Crude, rough lumber, mud-chinked walls, a floor of packed dirt covered with old canvas. It smelled of smoke and sweat and too many days sealed inside. But it was warm, noticeably, undeniably warm. How is it so warm in here? She asked. Outside was 5 below. Inside was 44 degrees. Caleb explained. The gap, the grass, the iron windbreak, the reduced volume. Martha listened, really listened this time. Not with the skepticism of September, but with the desperate attention of someone who'd nearly lost everything. I said you'd freeze in that metal box, she said when he finished. I said wait till real winter came. She paused. I was wrong, you were smarter than all of us. Then she said something that surprised him. I didn't testify for you at that trial. I saw Wolf plant that horse. I saw him and Pete ride past my place at midnight, leading that stallion toward your father's land. But I didn't speak up because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of losing everything. My husband's contracts with the Garretts, our livelihood. I chose my family over the truth. She looked at Edward, at his bandaged hands. But you saved my husband. You're a better man than most I know. I'm not looking for apologies, Caleb said. I'm looking for witnesses. When spring comes, I'm going back to Medora, and I'm going to make Wolf answer for what he did. Martha's expression hardened. He'll kill you. Maybe, but I survived winter in an iron box. I think I can survive one rich bully. Word spread through the cold months. The story of the boy in the iron box. The fugitive who'd built a home from scraps and survived the worst winter in living memory. A sheep farmer, south of Medora, built an inner room in an abandoned railroad storage shack. Used hay instead of grass, canvas instead of mud, but the principle was the same. He survived February with half the fuel his neighbors burned. The Johansson family, who had lost their barn to the January storm, took over a damaged rail car and followed Caleb's design exactly. 6 people in 100 square feet, but everyone warm, everyone alive. By fall of 1887, 11 boxcar conversions using the double shell technique had been documented between Medora and Glendive, 120 miles of railroad line. The section hands started calling the design the iron lung, a wooden room breathing inside a metal shell. Caleb didn't charge for advice. When people came asking, and they came more each month, he showed them. Walked them through the boxcar. Explained the gaps and the grass in the doors within doors. Harold gave me a broken stove when I had nothing, he told them. I'm not going to charge people for knowledge. That's not how you survive. You survive by helping each other. In early March, Thomas Garrett came to the coulee, first time since October. He rode to the rim and sat on his horse staring down at the boxcar with its thread of smoke at the boy who should have been dead. You're alive. The words came out flat, surprised. Caleb stepped out, knife in his hand. Not threatening, just there. Disappointed. How did you survive? Engineering, something you wouldn't understand. Thomas's face hardened. You're still a wanted man. Horse theft. I didn't steal your horse. You planted it. Prove it. I will, when I come back. Thomas laughed. Not humor, just sound. Come back to what your father sold his land to my father last month. Couldn't pay the bank. You've got nothing. The words hit like fists. Caleb hadn't known. Samuel had sold the land, the 20 acres along the Little Missouri, everything his mother had worked for, everything his family had built. Gone. Then I've got nothing to lose, Caleb said quietly. You think you can fight us? We own the judge, the sheriff, half the town. You don't own the truth, and you don't own the people who know it. Caleb stepped closer. Martha Blackwell saw you plant that horse. Edward Blackwell will testify. Harold Dawson will testify that you tried to let me die. Their word against mine. No, their word against a coward who bets on boys freezing to death. Thomas pulled his horse back. Something in his eyes had shifted. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty. This isn't over. No, but it will be when spring comes. Thomas rode away faster than he'd arrived. Caleb watched him go and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, but purpose. Spring came to the Badlands like a promise kept. The snow melted. The Little Missouri ran high with runoff. Grass pushed up through dead earth. And Caleb Morrison, who'd survived winter in a boxcar on stubbornness and engineering, prepared to go home. He'd lost 23 pounds since August. His clothes hung loose. His face was sharp angles and hard lines. He didn't look like the blacksmith's son anymore. He looked like something forged in cold and fire and left to harden. On April 15th, he rode ashes into Medora for the first time in 8 months. The town looked the same. False front buildings, dirt streets, the gallows where he should have died still standing at the end of Main Street, waiting for the next man the Garretts decided to get rid of. Caleb rode straight to the church hall, not to the sheriff, not to Judge Garrett's office, to the one place in town where people still pretended to care about truth. He found Pastor Williams and made a request, a public hearing, open to anyone who wanted to attend, a chance to present evidence about the horse theft charge. 200 people packed the church hall 3 days later. Every seat filled, people standing in the aisles. Half of Medora had come to watch. Martha Blackwell testified first, told the crowd she'd seen Thomas Garrett and Pete Rollins lead a horse past her property at midnight, heading toward Morrison land. Edward Blackwell testified second, told them Wolf had bragged about framing Caleb to get the river access. Harold Dawson testified third, told them about finding Caleb in the boxcar, about the design he'd built, about the storm that killed 7 men in proper cabins while a fugitive survived in a metal box. Marcus Garrett stood and objected, called it slander, called his son's accusers liars. But the crowd had already made up its mind. When it came time for Caleb to speak, he kept it simple. I didn't steal that horse. Thomas Garrett framed me so his family could take our land. My father was too weak to fight back. But I'm not my father. He looked at Thomas sitting in the front row with his father's face red with rage. I survived winter in a boxcar because I'm smarter than you thought. And I'll clear my name because the truth is stronger than your lies. The vote wasn't official, wasn't legally binding, but it was unanimous. The people of Medora believed Caleb Morrison over Thomas Garrett. And in a town, that small belief was currency. The sheriff had no choice but to drop the charges. Not enough evidence. Witnesses contradicting the accusation. A trial that had been rushed and irregular. Caleb Morrison walked out of that church hall a free man. He found his father at the old forge working for wages under a Garrett-owned roof. Samuel looked up when Caleb entered, and something broke in his face. You sold the land, Caleb said. Had to. Couldn't pay the bank. You could have fought, could have testified for me. I gave you a way out. That's all I could do. You gave me a horse and 45 cents. I gave myself a way out. Samuel set down his hammer. You're more like your mother every day. She'd be proud. And you, I lost the right to be proud when I let them take you. Caleb turned to leave, stopped at the door. I survived winter in a boxcar. I don't need your pride. I don't need anything from you anymore. That was the last time Caleb spoke to his father. In the fall of 1888, Caleb Morrison filed a homestead claim on the coulee where he'd survived. The Homestead Act required claimants to be 21 or heads of household, but a year of independent survival, and Harold Dawson's testimony made him qualified by any measure that mattered. He proved up the claim in 1893, built a proper farmhouse around the original boxcar, kept one wall of the inner room intact as a root cellar. In 1895, he married Sarah Hutchins' daughter of the ironmonger, who'd sold him nails when he was a fugitive with 10 cents. They had 3 children, 2 boys, 1 girl. All of them survived to adulthood. Caleb lived on that land for 47 years, worked as a blacksmith and consulting engineer designing heating systems for homesteaders who couldn't afford to fail. He died on August 12, 1934, at age 65. Heart failure, quick and clean. The homestead stayed in the family until 1952. On the day before Caleb died, he sat with his grandson James by the old boxcar, now incorporated into the farmhouse, like a heart in a rib cage. Grandpa, the boy asked, is it true you lived in this boxcar during the worst winter in history? I did. Were you scared? Every day. Then how did you do it? Caleb put his hand on the rusted iron shell, still there after 47 years, still solid. I did it because I listened to what everyone said was impossible. Then I built what no one believed would work. I did it because the right wall in the right place with the right gap between could turn a frozen coffin into a home. He looked at his grandson. Some walls keep things out, James, but the best walls keep everything in. Warmth, hope, the will to survive. He smiled, and that's a lesson worth remembering. On January 9, 1887, the temperature at Medora dropped 46 degrees in 7 hours. Thomas Garrett had bet that Caleb Morrison would freeze by Thanksgiving. Harold Dawson had said a boy alone wouldn't last till Christmas. The coyotes found nothing to scatter. What they found in a coulee 3 miles west of Medora was smoke rising from a stovepipe, a wooden room inside an iron shell, and an 18-year-old engineer who had listened to what everyone said was impossible, then built what no one believed would work. Caleb Morrison didn't survive because he was stronger than winter. He survived because he was smarter than fear.